There'll be no peace among the stars. An eternity of carnage, the slaughter, and the hideous laughter of ever-thirsting gods. Let the galaxy burn. The Chaos Gods represent one of the most malevolent forces in the galaxy humanity inhabits in the 41st millennium. By the 42nd millennium, these dark forces have become wide-reaching and cause destruction beyond estimation. They pervade reality, hanging as an ever-present shadow. Far from being disconnected from that reality, the dark entities known as the Chaos Gods have far-reaching powers and continually threatened to impact the long-term stability and safety of not just humanity, but nearly all races that inhabit the galaxy. While many races have probably a hand in giving rise to the Chaos Gods, it's reasonable to say that humanity, and certainly the Elder, have played some of the largest roles in contributing to the rise and strength of the Chaos Gods. Chaos largely exists not in the mortal galaxy, but in the pure energy realm of the immaterial, otherwise known as warp space. The Chaos Gods do not exist in isolation either. In fact, their very existence is continually fueled by the emotions and souls of sentient beings in the material space, or material warp space itself, is a bizarre and terrifying place. Two mortal entities. It exists without the established laws of time and space. It is a highly unstable realm, subjected to endless disturbances, not to mention the horrifying and immensely dangerous creatures that exists there, without enlisting the skills of psychic navigators, as well as the Emperor's astronomic on the psychic beacon back on Terror. Then, using the walk to travel would be immensely dangerous, if not impossible. Yet even with the power of the Emperor behind them, humanity, as it stands, would be unable to function without the use of the war. Even with this powerful means of crossing vast expanses of space, true long distance, travel across the galaxy can still take months or even years. Within this strange realm exists bizarre entities drawn to these psychic emanations of mortal creatures. Some of these entities, like the astral specters, are pure warp creatures who are formed by the psychic energy and ignorant actions of untrained psychos who are unknowingly, while exploring their powers, formed these creatures in the warp. Other entities, like the enslavers, are more ancient and are believed to have existed as far back as the War in Heaven, the galaxy's ruining war between the Old Ones and the Khotan Necron Alliance. The Old Ones had created many races before, but now they were forced to create beings with powerful psychic weapons to battle the nightmarish world-ending Khotan. The experimentation and subsequent learning processes of these early cycles would unknowingly disrupt the, at this time, relatively placid immaterial. Their psychic experimentations, usually with conflict in mind, would unknowingly fill the blank canvas of warp space with hellish creatures that would violently and forcibly breach the gap between warp and real space. Most powerful of these being the enslavers, and they would dominate, enslave, if you will, using the collapsed and transmuted bodies of early psychos as portals. This would then allow more of other warp entities into real space, and these walk beings would become one component of the downfall of the Old Ones, as their own creations then fell victim to the command of enslavers. Instead of being a tool to destroy the Khotan, the Old Ones found themselves hamstrung and fighting nightmarish entities they hadn't anticipated, despite their vast wealth of knowledge. These non-specific, undesignated warp entities will again breach real space to leap humanity again, exploiting the inexperienced and weak early psychosis of mankind during the warp storms of the Age of Strife. While these strange and terrifying entities within the warp are certainly unsettling and problematic for mankind and the other races in the galaxy, they are incomparable to the true masters of warp space, the gods and demons of chaos. These are devastatingly powerful entities who are formed from the same energy that comprises warp space itself. The gods of chaos would largely be birthed into the warp as early as 10,000 years BC. Humans, shamans, would detect and sense their malevolent presence. But even though the chaos gods would exist in one sense, they were far less active and destructive than they are in the 41st and 42nd millennium. At this early time, you could even describe them as being passive entities. The gods of chaos were more like a slow-boiling pot of water, the heat being humanity and other races. Inherently negative traits and vices. Itself is not a race. It's more of a collective designation and rel. It's primarily divided between four gods known as Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. Khorne is the blood god, representing war, rage, violence, hatred, and bloodshed. Tzeentch is the changer of the ways, representing volatility of change, such as overreaching ambition, plotting, convoluted scheming, and conspiracy. It also represents sorcery. Nurgle is the plague god, and it represents mortality, morbidity, and despair. And Slaanesh is the god of lust, greed, excess, hidden ISM, pleasure, pain, and perfection. The gods of chaos are manifested through sentient thoughts, minds, and emotions of the galaxy's inhabitants. The collective unconsciousness cumulatively shapes and allows the reactive warp, your immaterial, to give rise to such abhorred creatures as the gods of chaos. The existing mental activity across the galaxy then continues to sustain and nourish them. While the gods themselves in the warp are extremely powerful, they can only enter reality in a somewhat limited respect, such as by means of possession of those who have psychic abilities, as was the case during the Age of Strife, when mass possessions of early humans, psychos brought terrible and wide-reaching damage across the colonized planets of humanity. The Chaos Gods are also able to form and create lesser entities from the warp itself to push out into real space, essentially forging miniature extensions of themselves. These are the demons of chaos, whilst they themselves are not truly able to enter the material. Things have become progressively more severe since the formation of the Eye of Terror, and more recently with the formation of the Great Rift across the galaxy. Toward the end of the 41st millennium, the warp had been growing ever more unstable, and eventually, this struggle would lead to a massive tear in space across the entire galaxy. For humanity in the region containing Holy Terror, the tear appears as a scar across space, but for those imperial worlds on the far side of this tear in space, they now inhabit what has been designated the Dark Imperium. So called because on this side of the Great Rift, the light of the Emperor not shine. The Astronomicon is not visible to warp navigators, and travel and communication, and difficult at best. Eventually, over time, things will become somewhat more stable, but the massive tear across the galaxy leaves a continual shadow of darkness hanging over it. Where chaos had once been somewhat contained, it now pervades the entire galaxy, and nowhere is truly safe. Returning, though, to the Chaos Gods, while all inhabiting the same realm, they're generally speaking not a collaborative or united force working together. They simply happen to cohabit the warp. They are in a near-constant struggle, then conflict between themselves, and this ongoing battle of dominance is known as the Great Game, a game that can arguably never be truly won. There is often much discussion around what would occur if one of the Chaos Gods was somehow able to win the Great Game and take a primary position of dominance. Could the warp be returned to a balance, a state of serenity? Or would the warp itself consume real space, dooming all mortal races to a nightmarish future of complete and total chaos? Only the unending conflict that rages on allows the gods to have their share of power. The Great Game is generally the primary focus of the Chaos Gods. Much is spoken of chaos in mortal real space in the 42nd millennium. Now, especially more than ever, the talk of how severe a threat it represents, along with the ever-burgeoning chaos cults and well-known abhorrent traitors to the Imperium, such as the Chaos Space Marines. The gods themselves are far more concerned with their own struggles against one another in the warp, and in actuality, they're any direct a very small amount of attention and power toward the endpoint. Mortal realm. There are periodic instances where the chaos powers will set aside their differences and unite under a general banner of chaos itself. The rise of the Emperor of Man being one such time, the Chaos Gods felt his presence to be unsettling and dangerous to them, especially after some further details, which we'll talk about later. And so they engineered the great civil war among humanity, the Horus Heresy. But from the perspective of the Chaos Gods, this was barely a turn of the head, and a moment of their attention away from the Great Game. This game is also mirrored in their followers, as well as demons, who continued Great Game in or out of the immaterial when the galaxy was young. Whilst the warp existed as a realm, it had no distinct entities as such within it. It simply was energy flowing with the sentient emotions of the mortal material. Over time, this energy would become more and more defined and individually distinct. At some point in this early period of the first few millennia, Khorne would become the first to realize its ability to act independently from the larger, more abstract disturbances in the sea of the warp. Later, two others would follow, being Tzeentch and Nurgle. And so the first three gods were manifested in terms of human history. By the end of the second millennium, the fourth god, Slaanesh, wouldn't manifest until the catastrophic ending of Eldar society, as it had been known in Millennium 29. There are also a few minor gods of chaos, the most notable though being Malice, known as the Renegade or sometimes Fifth Chaos God, very rarely spoken of or written about. Now Malice represents pure anarchy, destruction, and terror. Malice itself represents the chaotic nature of the warp, and because of its destructive tendencies, will wage war against anything encounters, fighting both the powers of chaos and all mortal creatures. And you may think, well, isn't that already like the other chaos gods? True enough, except Malice is a pure form of that focus, and interestingly, unlike the other chaos gods, Malice can supposedly be summoned into reality, so long as enough sacrifices are given and a vessel body is available for him to take possession of it, while the strength and position of the gods shifts and is in constant conflict. There is a relatively established order or hierarchy between them. Khorne, as the first god of the immaterial, is seen generally as being the most powerful overall. This is attributed to the endless acts of murder, violence, and sacrifice that have been relentlessly ongoing since his inception. They continue to fuel and keep him filled with ether strength, with little, if any, respite. Khorne is believed to have risen during the Middle Ages of man. This period known for its excessive bloodshed and savage close-quarter battles, which would often result in massive casualties and entire battlefields being left awash with blood. Not to mention the ongoing cruelty, anger, and savagery of the age, wherein humanity would continually brutalize itself. Each conscious act of violence, fury, and bloodshed contributes to Khorne's power. Whether those individuals actively follow him as a god or not, followers of Khorne are warriors, without exception. He has nor requires no temples, is worshipped on the battlefield of mortal races. Khorne derives his Karnef meaning. Okay, I am not hearing that. Thank you for your commentary, but I am waiting for you to continue. Time is not the only element of our programming, but I am taking the necessary to bring it to your attention. The Lord of Rage, or Lord of Blood, Khorne, despises the use of magic and sorcery, and therefore most expressively hates the other gods of Tzeentch and / notable traitors of the Imperium who are lined with Khorne are the World Eaters. They are the 12th Space Moon Legion, and their Primarch, Anger, are also aligned with Chaos and Khorne. After the Heresy, they split into many smaller groups, such as the Forsworn Gore Hunters, the Blood Legion of Khorne. The list goes on, and we'll look more in detail at the specifics of Chaos Marines in future content. The other three Chaos Gods share more of a fluctuating and random combination of peaks and troughs, in accordance with how they draw their powers. Mortal events may imbue them with unexpected strength, which allows the momentary opportunities to become the strongest players in the eternal conflict of the great game. These spikes in power and dominance, and he always fleeting, and the eternal conflict continues on unabated. Tzeentch, though, is often seen as the second case, God in terms of general power and stability. And this entity draws strength from the endless desires in humanity to initiate change and better one's self-interests of the expense of others. While in some respect, these can even be positive drives, all too often within humanity, consciously, unconsciously, or surreptitiously, these desires lead to scheming, plotting, and corruption. The strength of drive to acquire a different life can result in burning down institutions and established norms. It can throw states into civil war and even threaten the stability of entire planets, not to mention the well-established greed of mankind. These drives can sometimes even create events that can determine the fate of the galaxy. All of this, in essence, is Tzeentch. It is the god of great change and despair in the material and the never-ending selfishness. The single-minded desires of power mean that mortal creatures can give designs with powerful bursts of ether or strengths as Tzeentch could be described as well as the architect of fate. The 15th Legion of the Thousand Suns became almost unintentionally associated with the Chaos God of Change, Magnus the Red. Their Primarch, also now elevated to a demon prince. The god Nurgle, however, is far less subtle than Tzeentch in how it draws its power. For Nurgle bathe and wallows in the agony, indeed the abject misery of others, physical corruptions, disease, plague, and galactic pandemics, or its dominion. Nurgle, as a god, is often regarded as the god of all, because few mortal creatures are able to escape physical corruption of one time or another. And whereas the other Chaos gods, usually align with specific individuals or those inclined to a certain activity or behavioral pattern. There is no discrimination with Nurgle. Nurgle also has a more active role in the plight of mortals than the other gods, in that those afflicted by disease or some nightmarishly disfiguring corruption, often then subsequently shunned, exiled, and ostracized by their own communities, leaving them in painfully hopeless situations, depressing misery, often having been turned on by everyone they may have imagined would help them in their time of need. They find themselves turning to dark whispers, to Nurgle. Well then, perhaps most disturbingly, not cure them from their diseased and disfigured state, as compensation for their spiritual devotion. If anything, their condition may often be exacerbated, but instead it will allow them to permanently live on in their unfortunately abhorrent condition, to remain as a horrific parody of their former selves, with some minor benefits, that being a relative state of physical relief. Most followers of Nurgle seem totally unaware their physical condition should be causing levels of pain and discomfort that would make any Nor being want to collapse and be put to death right there and then. This rotting of Nurgle and bloating of the body often also enables them to physically endure more damage and trauma, making the followers of Nagas more difficult to physically disposals. The followers of Nagas are almost universally extremely unpleasant forms to look upon or be in the immediate vicinity of. As with their pain, they are seemingly oblivious to the horrific appearance they do play to others. Perhaps most disturbingly, although beyond the physical, is that worshippers of Nurgle are afflicted with an ongoing permanent state of depression, but one that simultaneously brings some contradicting pleasure and satisfaction. Nurgle essentially is a disgusting perversion of mortality, deceiving its followers into a denial of their true self and distorting their perspective of reality. It's quite literally an abhorrent rot of the physical and mental self. The Death Guard, the 14th Space Marine Legion, are most associated with Nurgle. Mort Arian, the Primarch of the Death Guard, would become a demon prince of chaos and other powerful Marines like Typhus. A captain will become devastating champions, which then brings us conveniently to another god, which revels in perversion and distortion of reality. The god of pleasure, Slaanesh. Slaanesh has had an ongoing surplus of strength ever since it was birthed at the horrific cataclysm. There was the near total annihilation of the elder race, the shattering of their gods by Slaanesh, all brought about through their own excessively decadent and hedonistic ways. So Nash has a somewhat more neutral attitude toward the other three Chaos gods, as this attention is considerably more focused upon indulging it, same pleasure as is its nature. Its main opposing god, though, is Khorne, as Khorne represents violence, pain, war, and through these things, ultimately, death. Mostly Nash is much more about sustaining, for as long as possible, pleasure, pain beyond description and estimation. To end all of this early, through a bloody slaughter, is counterproductive to how Slaanesh gains strength, while the previous three gods are abhorrent to humanity and Xenos alike. Slaanesh is arguably the darkest of all their gods, which is not always apparent at first glance. To be held in near perpetual states of unimaginable psychological torture, to have pleasure senses dragged and extracted to levels which could be so intense as to be painful. It's a depraved entity that revels in not simply hedonistic pleasures, but prolonging all of these to the extreme. period, the third space brain needs, and the Emperor's children of the most notable followers of Slaanesh, and the best simply described as hedonistic psychopaths. Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's children, would also become a powerful demon prince. The strengths of all the Chaos Gods comes not from the most extreme acts defined by their characters. It's the very opposite. BC, whilst a great many acts and tidal waves of emotional horror and depravity at one time would birth the gods themselves, it is the inevitability of mortal conditions that, approximately, another parallel between demon princes and part of the mass effective dim, but Slaanesh, sustains and fuels them. For Khorne, endless physical conflict is as old as the mortal realm. It never ceases. It never calms. The struggle between mortals is eternal. With Tzeentch, the endless instability of mortal affairs leads to endless change and struggles for power. Nurgle, the god of all, is strengthened continuously by the inevitable decay, misery, and death that occurs constantly throughout the galaxy. As for Slaanesh, in its simplest and most innocent form, it is only the pursuit of happiness and to better oneself. But following further down this path leads to corrupting desire, that, little by little, eating away at a mortal desire from the inside, to gain a little more pleasure each time. Indeed, perhaps the happiness and pleasure is gained not even by the end results, but maybe in the acts themselves, requiring them to be a little bit more each time. Each time it is a creature that is filled by the latent inability of mortals to be content. Glory, wealth, success, physical desires, all of these lead down a path to Slaanesh, where any damnation awaits through the ever-changing shift of power in the great game. One of the goals may become dominant. There were the others for a time. The absolute goal is to have total domination over the immaterial, a goal which, by the very nature of their own limitations, is essentially unattainable. So they, in the warp, being that it is their dominion, is in a state of endless chaos. If one of the gods ascends to a position of dominance over the others, then the weaker forces, made temporarily not so much ally, as more work together toward the same goal of toppling the most powerful god at the time, to perhaps simply not pay more attention to the others, and then, later, return to end this power place as they fight each other to claim their position of dominance. Warp stones that periodically sweep the material, or a direct result of the Chaos Gods battling each other in their ether or planes. Armies of demons may battle each other within the wharf, or the mortal galaxy, as they vie for control to inflict relative damage to the power of the other gods. These ongoing wars between the powers are endless cycles of repeating conflict, temporary cooperation, backstabbing, betrayal, and corrupt conspiracy and exploitation of any sensed weakness, and opportunism. Humanity and races such as the Elder loved to bathe in their own egotistical self-importance, and so the endless skirmishes, incursions, and conflicts within the force of chaos, to them, must feel like a directed and focused effort from the Chaos Gods to ruin and obliterate them. In truth, these battles are far from a concerted effort by the Chaos powers to destroy the mortal races. In fact, these engagements are really more like spillage, the splashes and bleedings that exude from the far more severe, an ongoing struggle between the gods themselves. In the immaterial, with all of that said, there are periods where, for the briefest of moments, the Chaos Gods will turn their eye to the mortal real space and pierce it with a plan of evil consciousness. These moments of attention for the gods can represent devastating battles for survival for mortal civilizations. An opportunistic warp opening here, a summoned possession there. These gateways will often unleash a host of demons, of whichever power first became aware of the opportunity. It's demons lavishing the chance to slaughter and/or corrupt the mortal vessels that await them across whatever plane they happen to find themselves upon on the rare occasion that the powers sense something has dangerously allied against them, or force has risen that poses a genuine threat to their existence. This is when you may see the most dangerous allegiances known as Chaos Undivided. It's fairly self-explanatory, and considering that even at the worst of times in the ordinary galaxy, the ongoing problems of chaos are only a small amount of their attention, you can barely imagine the danger and threat that the combined forces and attentions of the Chaos Gods represents. As mentioned, the rise of the Emperor was one such occasion, and it nearly led to the entire destruction of humanity. However, as soon as such matters are resolved, the gods will immediately use that momentary lapse to attempt to exploit the others. This, in part, explains why, at the end of the Horus Heresy, the forces of the traitorous Space Marines of Chaos was so quick to flee, collapse, and retreat. It seems fair to assume that with the death of Horus and the near-fatal wounding of the Emperor, to the point he became a far more ineffective entity for mankind, the gods of chaos likely slapped their attention back towards their own conflicts in the warp and away from the trivial conclusion of the devastating heresy war during the period of scouring. All of this brings us to a fairly common question, though: why are there no positive gods in the immaterial? If a sentient being's emotions and desires, as well as their general conscious or unconscious feelings, form the entities within the warp, then it stands the logical reason you would surely see positive creations as well as these very negative ones, correct? This is, generally speaking, best marked as one of those things we could class as poorly defined or just not well understood. We know that there are lesser entities out there in the warp, and that it's reasonable to assume that they are just relatively unapparent or smothered by the presence of more powerful chaos gods. Some, of course, even going so far as to speculate that the Emperor himself is potentially a positive godlike creature. He is, after all, an anathema to the chaos gods. It also raises further questions, like, do the chaos gods truly represent darkness and evil, or is that a subjective human definition? The chaos gods, for example, revels in change and disruption. The last, it's true, you can make a connection of change and disruption being a negative thing. Another view would be that it simply represents an opposing position of order and stability. Do we attach automatically the concept of evil to this? It's true that within the Chaos Pantheon, their followers and wars caused devastating suffering, but arguably no more than any other race in the far future. And humanity itself is no beacon of purity and innocence when it comes to such things. It's worth remembering as well that without the depraved, selfish, lessness, violence, and all the worst traits of mortal races, the chaos gods wouldn't even exist. So it's hard, when you really think about it, to ascribe that they are mindlessly evil. If anything, the chaos gods are a reflection of mortals as they peer into the ocean of the warp with their souls. But so much of what occurs in the galaxies of the far future, humanity will and has always attached unobjective, even irrational emotions and fears to events or individuals. It's what enables them to be perceived as being fundamentally good or bad. The Xenos race of the Orc. I am good. Example, often seen by humans to be foul, war-hungry, yes, even evil creatures bent on mindless destruction. Brutal horrors, carnage, and slaughter without end. But with further study, we know this not to be exclusively true. Orcs are not evil because they are not driven by higher, premeditated grand plan. They operate by design and instinct. And within that, you could also include the Tyranids, who operate with much of the same core drives. Depending how far along you want to go with this, it can become significantly complicated and very, period. Philosophical. Ultimately, we view things with a human point of view. But the key thing to understand is that chaos is not as simple as it being bleak darkness or evil. That is a humanistic projection overlaid onto it. In some respects, elements of the chaos gods and what they represent are actually positives, depending on your point of reference. And in saying this, I can feel impaired inquisitors heading my way with increasing urgency. Truly, though this is where things are slightly contentious, it's never to my knowledge expressly explained about the morality or the positive-negative aspects of the chaos gods. There are subjective interpretations and quotations, and arguably, it's just a matter of perception. We could, for example, look from an orc's perspective. A god like Khorne, that is a concentrated expression of violence and bloodlust, would not look dark, evil, and abhorrent. Ron or Khorne would look pretty positive, appealing, energizing even. Now, of course, were it not for the fact that orcs have their own gods, Gork and Mork, I would never have any interest in following or worshipping chaos on the other side of the coin. To some ordinary, non-superhuman citizens, extreme violence, bloodlust, and death is perhaps shockingly not so positive or appealing. Are the chaos gods truly evil? Or do they simply represent a balance of combined expression, where from a human perspective, the negative aspects are much more pronounced? Khorne, for example, is known by some to also represent honor and courage. The Tzeentch world, change can be a negative, can be a positive. Nurgle, while in this time, undoubtedly, it's slanted more towards horrific plague and mutation. Yet it also, to one degree, can be about rebirth and even salvation and Slaanesh, while all about dark and hedonistic excesses is also about life and positive experiences, albeit for yourself. Some few would even go so far as to suggest its own ash can represent the love. I would imagine this to be more of an all-consuming love, though that makes someone behave dangerously and irrationally. But love nonetheless. Chaos and the chaos gods can be not only about destruction and horror, but about the exploration of the further realms of experience. They are the edge of the expanse of consciousness and exist beyond the limits of human imagination. To this end, can you ever really say you would understand such beings, or be able to comprehend what they could offer, what they could show you, or how this would alter your perception? I think, to quote another explorer, beyond the mortal world, the chaos gods and their domains are seen as demons to some, angels to others. Devout members of the Imperium, sickly sake, would say that these arguments are made by ruined and corrupted chaos cultists who are trying to merely rationalize the dark powers of the war. It's also possible, though, that from a human perspective, positive gods still emerge in the warp, or even that they always have. But perhaps they're simply nowhere near as powerful as the other entities that exist there, and are crushed and obliterated before they have a chance to grow. If you want to really get to the core of this, though, it's humanity's own self-delusions about positivity being as much, or more, prevalent than negative traits. Whilst it's true that most humans aspire to have positive aspects in their lives, you need to look at the larger picture and start to consider if the collective, positive experiences are really that substantial, powerful, in the grand scheme of things, or are they just more like positive background radiation in terms of their influence to the war? If you think of emotions and self-expression as needing to be of sufficient strength to essentially register in the war, it helps to explain why, when you look at the creation of the Chaos Gods, they only generally seem to occur after significant periods of sustained, powerful, often traumatic, and not just ordinary, but extreme emotions and expressions. We see that these resonated with enough strength to enable them to be able to come into a state of sentience. This, to me, suggests that it is only the most powerful feelings, all those on the edge of the spectrum of emotion, that registers and contributes to the warp most significantly. While positive feelings, like family bonding, loyal, honor, appreciation of art and beauty, and of course love and devotion, can be powerful in moments, do those situations happen more often and in significant strength to counterbalance their generally more regular and arguably more powerful negative aspects of pain and suffering that are and always have been so widespread. So again I say, it's worth noting that the Chaos Gods only begin to appear after a significant period of fairly extreme concentrated outpouring of consciousness and suffering before they were able to consume this power and come into being. Once they reached this critical mass of emotive energy that allowed their creation, they simply needed to just continue on while the endless emotive energy would continue. Then to sustain their needs, it was enough that they had been created and would then just exist until the later periods in human history, where their strength would become significant after the huge levels of horrific destruction that would befall mankind. Essentially, it would have taken or would take a very, very powerful, consistent act of positive consciousness to bring a true positive God into existence within the war. And that is very unlikely given the current state of mankind in the 42nd millennium, or any time previous. Of course, there is also just the even more simple rationalization with the war, for whatever reason, is just more receptive to what we define as negative emotions and their associated actions than positive. For whatever reason, in relation to how we perceive the war, one thing that I think is a mistake to envision is negative forces as dark and positive forces as light. That is something always projected onto them. This is an age-old description, and it's like so many things, overly simplistic, and a part of humanity's embedded cultural delusions. We love to rationalize things in human terms. To visualize bringing a light into darkness is always going to prevail. It's simple to imagine because it's an ancient illustration from a time in human history where these visualizations were designed to easily illustrate two opposing perspectives. They demonstrate to people but the righteous power and the sight that they needed to align themselves with, to show them the positive aspects, nullifying the negative ones. Light overpowers or pushes away the darkness. However, if you want to continue along with that thinking, you might also imagine that light may hold back the darkness, but that it never truly extinguishes it. Darkness is always there, waiting, and as soon as the light weakens, the darkness begins to creep in, to bleed into the edges of a room, to encroach and allow pockets of darkness to exist. Those small areas of darkness, who knows what they hold, and if their light dwindles or is extinguished, darkness will envelop what remains and dominate that space. The best summation is that a lot of perceptions are informed by realities, but they themselves have individually experienced or being taught. There's undoubtedly also plenty of projection, occurring with people assigning negative traits to chaos. In reality, the gods themselves will not perceive law, be concerned by definitions so entirely human. One thing is for sure, though. Once the gods began to be aware that the activities of mortals outside their realm could imbue them with strength and thereby enable them to carry more strength into their great game, they became far more interested and proactive in influencing events in the material realm. This is where the followers like cultists, Stardies, traitors, and demons fit within the realm of chaos. They are the laborers of the gods, and their acts are always only to benefit their masters. Still, followers of chaos are not only those who can benefit from the realm. It is in fact suggested that the emperor gains some knowledge by traveling through a gateway to the realm of the all-powerful chaos gods, apparently appeasing them with promises only he could give, and they in return allowed him to return with these science, to unlock the mysteries of creation. This knowledge would enable him to create the demigod-like figures of the Primox, the Emperor, though seemingly lying to the dark gods about his intentions, would then suffer at the hands of their powers, as they scattered the gestating pods of the Primarchs across the galaxy, and they would not be reunited with the Emperor until the Great Crusade. Now, these realities only further muddy the water around the Emperor and his true intentions, his foresight and knowledge about chaos, why he would consider such actions as being necessary, all that he could rehab back out of deals made with these gods of the immaterial, and what his intentions were with regard to his own position within the multi-millennia spanning history of humanity in the dark future. Chaos is the most significant enemy of humanity in the future. The gods of the walk continually sow the seeds of any number of corrupting ways that eat away at our lives and our consciousness. These seeds of doubt, of fear, hatred, selfish ambition, fester and rot away under the surface of society and the institutions of the Imperium, threatening to eat it alive from the inside out. Chaos God seek to eternally exert their influence on the mortal realm, on its many races, and allow literal chaos to reign and give them strength for their great game. Interestingly, though, the Chaos Gods also have, by their nature, a symbiotic relationship with the entities of the material. Because the Chaos Gods only gain power through the actions, emotions, and emanations of mortals collectively. So, ensuring chaos, unrest, death, destruction, misery, and even hedonistic pleasures are all part of their aims. The total destruction of humanity, or all mortal races, would not be to their own best interests, whether they're aware of it or not, or whether they even care about that or not. Without us, they would slowly cease to exist in their current form, and would likely dissipate back into the warp until it was again a calm, balanced realm. In that respect, races like the Tyranids are far more literally dangerous. However, it is the insidious nature of chaos that makes it so despised. It is so often not an enemy in plain sight. in hides, corrupts, and distorts the innocent. Whether the gods are truly aware of how reliant they are on mortals is another matter. They show little signs of concern. For this and their ongoing battle to destroy and corrupt continues, even ever more severely in the 42nd millennium. Now, the Great Rift has torn through the galaxy, enabling the forces of chaos to have an ever more violent and invasive capacity. Now we will further explore the gods and forces of chaos in the future. They stand as the keepers of nightmarish hellscape that most mortals dared to even imagine. Chaos has already inflicted untold damage on many races in the galaxy, most obviously the Elder and the Impairment Man, and they show no signs of relenting in the ever-ongoing quest to dominate all. Yet there is always hope, always, but the grim darkness of the far future looks ever darker, with the strength and reach of the Chaos Gods being ever more pronounced. But there are those who care little about the forces of chaos and the gods therein, creatures, like the orcs and Tyranids. They also remain those, like the Eldar and mankind, who all too well aware of the danger that chaos poses to the entire galaxy, to turn it into a warped, distorted realm of complete, total, and literal chaos. And then there were the younger races, like the Tau, who only now are beginning to understand the true nature of chaos. High Inquisitor Brayless Laws, once known to have said that if my time in the Black Library taught me anything, it was controversially that chaos is already very much part of us. It deals in the currency of mortal souls and feeds off states and emotions that are in essence natural. Without us, there would be no chaos. Good and evil, right and wrong. These are binary oppositions that the inhabitants of this galaxy use to comfort and define themselves. I'm afraid much of the God Emperor's work is done in the gray area in between. This is the more truly worrying reality. The humanity is chaos, and chaos is humanity. Chaos is the ugly horror of ourselves. It's the side of ourselves we cannot face. It is the darkness that we define upon each other. It is the evil that men do. It is the distilled nature of mortals. The Imperium suffers because of chaos. This will always be so. But humans butcher, torture, repress, abuse, and conspire against one another. Do we do all this because we want it to be so? Or do we do this because the dark gods require? Do we know that humanity has free will? Or are we being danced like puppets to the tune and the whispers of the Dark Lords, more powerful than any mortal can understand? Now there are always many powerful quotes around the more defined chaos gods of Khorne, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. But I think I would finish with something as Tzeentch would have it, that the Imperium is founded on chaos.